Good morning, everyone. This is Director Brzezowski. Thank you for attending the spring meeting of the Drought Interagency Coordinating Group. Before we start, I would like to ask Nemesis Ortiz to go over the webinar logistics to assure that our virtual meeting will go as smoothly as possible. So, Nemesis, please proceed.
Thank you, Director Brzezowski. This meeting is being recorded and will be posted on the Arizona Department of Water Resources YouTube page and on the ADWR Drought website. We would like to ask meeting attendees to please mute yourselves when you are not speaking. This will prevent echoing during the meeting. And to please type your questions, comments in the chat, and we will read and respond to those throughout the meeting. If you have any technical difficulties, please contact the Arizona Department of Water Resources Help Desk at 602-771-8444, or you can email tickets@azwater.gov. Thank you.
Thank you. Before we proceed, I'd like to give an opportunity for Alan Clark, my co-chair and the director of the Arizona Division of Emergency Management, to introduce himself and make any opening remarks he would like to make. Alan, go ahead. Alan, I'm not hearing anything on my end from you if you are trying to speak.
Director Brzezowski, I do not see Alan as part of the participants right now. He might be joining later.
All right, thank you. So again, this group has met biannually since 2006 to make a recommendation to the governor about whether to maintain the drought emergency declaration, which has been in place since June 1999. This is an advisory group to the governor composed of over 20 federal and state agencies. After the presentations, we will decide on the recommendation. Seemingly a no-brainer to me, but we need to make the record and hear about all the information and impacts we're seeing because of the continued and worsening drought in Arizona and in the West. So I would ask members to avoid speaking over one another. Please introduce yourself using the chat box. Add your name and who you represent so that all the participants can see that, and so we have a record of who attended and spoke at the meeting. Again, we will go through the presentations. We will gather the information as appropriate. We will discuss that at the end when we deliberate on making a recommendation. And we will start with Dr. Erin Saffel's presentation on the drought status update and monitoring technical committee activities. Erin is the state climatologist and the drought monitoring technical committee co-chair. So Erin, if you're ready, please proceed.
Thank you for the introduction and good to see everyone again. We can go to the next slide, please. So let's start with a look at the upper and lower Colorado basins. The 6 maps listed together show the seasonal fall and winter precipitation for the last 6 water years. Water year 2016 is in the upper left corner. Water year 2021 is listed in the lower right corner. Our current water year is the larger chart on the far left side of the screen. While the Little Colorado River Basin did well based on some gauges in the White Mountains, the other basins in Arizona were generally below 90% of the average water year precipitation. The bright red color in the Verde and the upper and lower Gila basins show 50 to 70% of average water year precipitation. I'm sure we'll hear more about these results in a bit. So next slide, please. Thank you. Looking at our precipitation for the water year to date, The best perspective is shown on the map on the right side of the screen. That's the percent of average precipitation for the water year. December was a good month for precipitation, with above average amounts in many locations across the state. For the most part, though, every other month for this water year has been below average. You'll see there are two 80 to 90% bullseyes in Mojave County, and those are the orange areas. One is, from a good precipitation event at Kingman at the end of March. The other was from an extreme December at Pipe Spring National Monument. Unfortunately, Mojave County as a whole is still well below average for the water year. When we're looking at East Central Coconino and Central Navajo and Apache counties, they had higher amounts of precipitation this winter, as did areas along the Mogollon Rim and Tonto Basin. These are shown on the map as 80 to 90% of average precipitation for the water year. Next slide, please. For perspective, I think it's good to look at the calendar year. So now we're looking at calendar year precipitation, January through April. The percent of average precipitation for the calendar year is the map on the right side, just like we saw before. You can see the impact in Mojave County from the March event in Kingman. Still looking at this map, Winslow is the orange colored bullseye in Navajo County with near normal precipitation in February and March. Overall, though, for the calendar year, the western third of the state is less than 25% of average precipitation for the calendar year, and the remaining 2/3 of the state is less than 50% of average for the calendar year. The lighter red areas in southeast Coconino County, Navajo County, Gila County approach up to 70% of average precipitation, again, for the calendar year. So next slide, please. The statewide precipitation for the first 6 months of the water year has an average of 6.32 inches. So that's for the state. If we zoom into the counties, all counties for our water year so far are below their average amount of precipitation. The numbers shown in the counties are the individual departures from the county's average, so how much below their average amount they are. Again, that's for the first 6 months of the water year. The legends colors on this map aren't helpful in understanding the water year averages, though. For example, Gila County is at 64% of their average water year precipitation, but Santa Cruz is only at 38% of their average water year precipitation. Apache and Navajo counties are at around 75% of their average water year precipitation. Next slide, please. So these rankings help provide some context for each county's average water year precipitation. So that's to date. The closer the ranking is to 1, the drier it is. As I mentioned, every county is below their average water year precipitation so far, but now you can see how Santa Cruz County is ranked as one of the driest for its water year to date. The same for La Paz, Pima, and Cochise counties. Next slide, please. This chart shows the U.S. Drought Monitor intensity levels since 2000. Our current year is on the far right side of the chart. From this chart, Arizona is actually currently better than we were at the same time last year. And that's not saying that we won't or can't return to those levels, but it does say we're in a better short-term drought position this year than we were last year. Next slide, please. Thank you. And so you may remember the Drought Monitor from last year. So you can see the June 15, 2021 chart that we're looking at there. And so last June, 87% of the state was in extreme or exceptional drought. Our fortunate and amazing summer served to decrease some of the short-term drought impacts. The last time the state saw exceptional drought was last August. Currently, the majority of the state is in severe or moderate drought. 6% of the state is currently in extreme drought. Next slide, please. This chart shows statewide precipitation from October through March for the period of record. So it goes back to 1895. and it shows the first 6 months of every water year. A reminder that the average amount of precipitation for the first half of the water year is 6.32 inches. That's the long-term average for October through March for the state. The current water year 2022 is shown on the far right side of the chart. The state has so far received 3.78 inches of precipitation for the water year, which is 60% of the average amount. Last time this year, the state had received only 2.97 inches, which was 47% of the statewide average. Next slide, please. Thank you. We evaluate long-term drought with the Standardized Precipitation Evapotranspiration Index, or SPEI. We use the SPEI because the index not only evaluates precipitation, but also potential evapotranspiration. Potential evapotranspiration considers temperature and wind conditions because these influence aspects of water loss. Long-term drought is analyzed from the previous 24, 36, and 48-month timeframes. These maps are showing the progression of the long-term drought in Arizona for the last 12 months. There was expansion of the long-term drought shown in last year's April map, and then mitigation in the September and December maps. The timeframes used to calculate these maps were actually less dry than other longer-term timeframes. Consequently, the longer-term drought for the March map, it appears to improve in central and southern counties. So next slide. For that reason, to verify our longer-term drought, it's helpful to look at other timeframes of the SPEI, so longer terms. This chart shows the SPEI calculated for 1 month through 60-month timescales. That's what you see on the y-axis on the left side of the chart. On the x-axis on the bottom of the chart, it shows these calculations for each month starting January 1981 through March 2022. So March 2022 is shown on the far right side of the chart, and it shows the long-term drought continuing through this water year. Next slide, please. Thank you for your time. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Do we have any questions for Dr. Sappel from members of the group? Please do so in the chat. Raise your hand in the chat, and we'll allow you to unmute and ask your question. And I'll take a moment in our virtual world to let that happen. Seeing anything?
There are no questions in the chat.
All right, thanks, Nemesis. So again, thank you for the presentation. Very telling information, as always, from you, Dr. Sappel. So next, we will go to the 2022 weather outlook, and Mark O'Malley, the lead forecaster for the National Weather Service and Drought Monitoring Technical Committee co-chair, will give us that presentation. Welcome, Mark.
Thank you very much, Director Bushatsky. I've been doing this for nearly a decade, and I think this is probably the most important interagency coordination group meeting we've had, for obvious reasons. I'll try to point out some of the positives going forward, but I have to be realistic. This is not going to be a rosy presentation. So if we go to the next slide. We've undergone 2 consecutive La Nina winters. La Nina, for those that don't know, is not favorable for improving drought conditions, and in fact has been pretty detrimental during the winter. On the left-hand slide, we can see the temperature anomalies much above normal. This was in 2020, 2021, and also the precipitation anomalies in the lowest 10th percentile. So 2 years ago, very warm, very dry. If we go to the next slide, the subsequent current La Nina we're in, almost identical situation. Temperatures, again, very much above normal. I'll talk about this in further slides, but this is a trend we've been seeing for decades now. The precipitation slightly better this year, as Dr. Saffel showed, but still for a large percentage of the state this water year, we've been suffering. So these are 2 consecutive La Niñas. Keep this in mind as we go forward and I get towards the end of the presentation. So if we go to the next slide, I'll look at the forecast for this summer. Last monsoon was actually very good for us, but the problem for us has been this temperature trend. The probabilities this summer, again, favor warmer than normal conditions for the entire state and the region for that matter. The temperature trend, as we see on the right-hand graph, it's unmistakable. We've just been getting warmer every year. There's no reason to believe that this summer will not continue this trend. There's no reason to believe that this trend is going to change anytime soon. If you click forward, last year, despite all the rain, most people would say, oh, it wasn't that bad of a summer. Well, if we look at it in the perspective of 30 years ago in the early 90s, a summer like last year would have been one of the warmest on record. But now it's par for the course now. So this is really where I want to re-emphasize that this trend is not going anywhere. We're going to see repeatedly that in the upcoming presentations that our unregulated inflow continues to suffer. And a lot of this has to do with this temperature trend. Our climate keeps getting warmer, so we're adding all that extra heat, extra evaporation, extra really drying the soils out even quicker, and that's really hurting us. So the plans that we made 30, 40, 50 years ago are not really accurate anymore and not going to be accurate going into the future. I get the positive out of this is that we can and we need to incorporate these trends going forward. And this is our chance to really look at this data and say, going forward, we need to adjust how we're, allocating water and smartly using water in the state. So if we go on to the next slide, looking at the rainfall after La Nina winters, and in the bottom right was last year was a fairly good monsoon rainfall, especially for the southern half of the state. Once you get into the upper part of the Colorado Basin, it's a little more hit and miss. It necessarily wasn't that great last summer for the upper basin. And looking through these, for Arizona, there's more of the blues, which are above normal precipitation, rather than the reds, but the upper basin, it's kind of hit or miss. So this is going to be key going forward this summer is, can we get enough moisture to really help out the soil moisture? Realistically, a realistic outcome would be that it helps recharge our soil moisture going into next winter. The best case, which we kind of saw last summer, would be there would be somewhat more widespread increases in soil moisture profiles. We would also help reduce the water demand and maybe even get some inflow and side flows into the regional reservoirs. But in reality, monsoon rainfall really can't be counted on to offer much long-term relief to some of the regional water issues. This is more of a short-term, as Dr. Saffel showed, short-term help, but in the long term, we really need to look at the whole year and especially the winter rain and snowfall. So if we go on to the next slide, this kind of highlights the outlook going forward. And very similar to what I showed last year at this time, there's a very slight increase in the odds that we could be wetter than average for the southern part of Arizona this monsoon. But this is really just a very modest tilt in the odds. For any given location, there's still a 25 to 30% chance that you could be below average. And really, based on the nature of summertime thunderstorms, one community could get a really good downpour of rain and have a very good summer, whereas 20, 50 miles away may miss a lot of the thunderstorm activity and be drier than average. So really, again, this is just a short-term localized help for us, but the long term, we need more. And on the right-hand graph, the red dots are the same years that I showed in the previous slide of recent summers following weak to moderate La Niñas. Last year, way up there, very good summer for us. But overall, it's a very mixed bag. There's no trend in our precipitation trends like we see in the temperature trends. And so, again, realistically, get average precipitation, help out in a local fashion, but we can't count on them. This is going to happen and really help us in the long term. So go on to the next slide. The key for us is going to be what happens with El Nino and La Nina. And unfortunately, the trend recently has been towards this La Nina is holding on. It's not giving up. And the highest cluster of models that we look at are really hovering in this lower blue area towards the La Nina. I guess the good part is this time of year, these model predictions, once you get past a few months, are not necessarily very reliable. So we can hope that we get back in towards the neutral area as we go forward. But really, go to the next slide. If we look at probabilities, there's really only about a 50-50 chance that we are either in La Nina or a neutral phase. Very little chance of an El Nino, but at least the neutral phase, if we can get into that next winter, many neutral winters are favorable for us. But again, we can't be making plans on hopes that something happens. We really do need to prepare that we could be in another La Nina winter, and that really increases the prospect that we'll be drier than normal again next winter. So go forward to the next slide. And these probabilities from the Climate Prediction Center are somewhat contingent on the La Nina continuing into next year. Then because the models are not necessarily that reliable this far out, the percentages are rather small. However, there is a tilt in the odds towards drier than average in the bottom right slide. And this is not just for Arizona, this is regionally as well. California did not have a very good winter this year. The Sierras had a couple good events, but they were much below average like we were. So it's not just Arizona, it's a regional issue that we're dealing with here. So go on to the next slide. And this should just be a summary of what I covered, but really the odds favor warmer than average summer. This is a problem for us, and it's going to be a problem going forward. This is our trend, and there's no sign that this trend is going to change anytime soon. There's a slight increase that will be wetter than average this monsoon, but there's a lot of randomness in the thunderstorms. So not everyone is guaranteed that they're going to get that amount of rain. This is just a localized short-term improvement. The best case is we would help improve those soil moisture profiles. That could help us going forward next year, again, but it might just be on a very localized level. There's not a lot of confidence in these climate models, but again, there's about a 40 to 50% chance that this La Nina will persist or redevelop next year. So we need to make those plans going forward. And again, if it is a La Nina, that really favors another dry winter. So just to be realistic here, I don't want to, be totally negative, but we have to be realistic going forward. And with that, I will take any questions.
Thank you, Mark. Any questions from members of the group for Mark?
There are no questions in the chat.
So Mark, I will just say a couple things. I appreciate your realistic viewpoint. I agree with you. I appreciate also where you had opportunities to talk about maybe the slight positives, but we do need to be realistic. We do need to plan for the trends you're showing. And I know you focused on the temperature trend in Arizona, but my understanding is in the Colorado River Basin, that same temperature trend you showed us is occurring in the basin as well and severely impacting the runoff that we're seeing, the precipitation and snow in the upper basin. Is that something that you're aware of as well for the basin of the Colorado River?
That is exactly correct. This is a regional temperature increase. And if you just think about it, the warmer it is, the higher the snow levels and the earlier the runoff and the more negative it is for us as far as the inflows and the hydrologic availability. So that is exactly correct.
Thanks, Mark. And I appreciate the temperature trend data because I've been here since 1978 and I thought my anecdotal evidence of that it's harder and harder to get through the summers was maybe a function of my aging, but clearly it's not. The data shows it is getting hotter and hotter since I came here in the 1970s, and the summers are seemingly longer and longer. So I appreciate all of that. And you did mention you've been doing this for over a decade, and we appreciate that service you provided and look forward to hoping that you can continue working with us on these important issues. With that, then, I'll move on to the next presentation, agenda item 5, and that is a Colorado River water supply update. Rachel Von Nechten from the Colorado Management section of DWR will lead us through that presentation. So go ahead, Rachel.
Thank you, Director Buchowski. You can go to the next. So we're going to start with a brief view of the Colorado River System reservoir status. As of April 25th, Lake Powell was below 3525 feet at an elevation of 3522.51 feet with a storage of 5.77 million acre feet or 24% of capacity. Lake Mead was at elevation 1056.15 feet with a storage of 8.13 million acre feet or 31% capacity. For the smaller upper basin reservoirs, we have Fontenelle at 46%, Flaming Gorge at 78%, Blue Mesa at 29%, followed by Morrow Point at 95%, and finally Navajo at 54%. Looking at the reservoir system as a whole, we have roughly 20.51 million acre feet in storage, or 34% of system capacity. This is approximately a 5.17 million acre feet decrease from this time last year. Next slide, please. This is the snow water equivalent chart for above Lake Powell. The 1991 to 2020 median is shown in purple, and we have our current year 2022 in blue, and 2021 is included in green for comparison. 2021 was the third worst April through July unregulated inflow at 1.85 million acre feet. As of May 3rd, current snow water equivalent is at 54% of seasonal median. Again, after a great start at the end of 2021, things have steadily been declining. The April forecast for unregulated inflow into Lake Powell has fallen to 4.1 million acre feet. Here we have the Lake Powell end-of-month elevations from Reclamation's most recent 24-month study and 2-year probabilistic projections. The probable max is in blue, and the most probable is in most probable is in green, and probable min is in red. The individual gray lines are the additional traces from the CRIMS ESP projection. These individual traces and model runs are produced by Reclamation to provide additional information about risk and uncertainty for near-term planning horizons and help us to see that there can be traces below the probable min and above the probable max. The first vertical yellow line marks the end of calendar year 2022. The end of calendar year 2022 most probable elevation projection is 3515.05 feet with a probable minimum to probable max range of 3504.04 feet to 3547.32 feet. The second yellow line marks the end of calendar year 2023. The end of calendar year 2023 most probable elevation projection is at 3522.38 feet with a probable minimum to probable max range of 3494.17 feet to 3586.81 feet. You may have seen the news coverage regarding actions by both the upper and lower basins to protect the elevation of Lake Powell. The April modeling does include 350,000 acre feet being held back in Lake Powell. However, this modeling is still showing the adjusted release pattern that would send that 350,000 acre feet to Lake Mead June through September. This modeling does not show the upcoming releases of 500,000 acre feet from Flaming Gorge down to Lake Powell. We anticipate the measures by both the upper and lower basin to protect the elevation of Lake Powell will be incorporated into Reclamation's May 24-month modeling. These measures are intended to protect water supply and infrastructure, and benefits to hydropower are only ancillary and not the primary purpose for holding water in Powell. Next slide, please. Now we're looking at the Lake Mead end-of-month projections from the most recent 24-month study and the 2-year probabilistic projections. The end of calendar year 2022 most probable elevation projection is 1047.10 feet, with a probable minimum to probable max range of 1045.01 feet to 1049.08 feet. The end of calendar year 2023 most probable elevation projection is 1037.44 feet, with a probable minimum to probable max range of 1017.07 feet to 1043.24 feet. These projections do include some of the 500-plus plan activities, but not all. System conservation agreements that have been executed by all parties are included in the modeling. In the April 24-month study, this includes approximately 232,000 acre feet. There remains about 67,000 acre feet still to be included in the model as additional agreements are executed. And that concludes my presentation, and if there are any questions, I'm happy to take them.
So before we get to questions, I want to supplement this a little bit in terms of the actions that the United States government announced in a letter and in a press event yesterday. So the Assistant Secretary for Water and Science, Tanya Trujillo, did announce in her letter and in a press event this action moving forward, that 500,000 acre feet from Flaming Gorge will be moved into Lake Powell, and that instead of Lake Powell delivering 7.48 million acre feet in this water year to Lake Mead, it will deliver 7 million acre feet. That roughly 1 million acre feet of water that's going to be left behind in Lake Powell is really important to protect infrastructure at Glen Canyon Dam. And when I say that, what that really means is it's to protect the ability of that infrastructure to move water through the dam, downstream through the Grand Canyon and into Lake Mead. So Rachel mentioned hydropower might be an ancillary benefit, but it's not the reason that that plan is being put into place. The reason is to protect against potential infrastructure problems. As Lake Powell falls below 3525 towards the minimum power pool elevation of 3490, the lake's already fallen a few feet below 3525. They're operating without issue so far, but there's a lot of uncertainty about how that infrastructure will operate as the lake potentially approaches 3490. And once water can no longer be moved through the power generators at whatever elevation that is, and of course at 3490, that will happen. How much water can be moved through the outlet works down the river and into Lake Mead is a huge uncertainty and a huge question. So this is really about protecting water through the Grand Canyon, protecting the water supplies that are going to Lake Mead, and offsetting potentially the draconian reductions that might be required if volumes of water cannot be moved from Lake Powell to Lake Mead. I think there's been some confusion in the press about the purposes of this action. I saw a Capital Times article this morning that said this is all about protecting hydropower, and that is not the case. Again, we know how important hydropower is. We applaud the fact that we're going to get this potential hydropower benefit. Of course, there will be some maybe potential attendant issues with hydropower long-term at Lake Mead for the water that's not going to Lake Mead. So if folks are interested in hearing more details about the situation at Lake Powell and Lake Mead and about the challenges facing us on the Colorado River, there's a joint briefing Friday from 9 to 11. It's in person at the CAP or virtual, and you can see the address for the virtual meeting on either DWR or CAP's website, but it's a joint briefing by the Bureau of Reclamation, by DWR, and by CAP, and so we'll get into a lot of the details of what's going on with the river, the risks and operations at Glen Canyon Dam and Lake Mead, Hoover Dam. And so I would urge folks to tune in to that presentation because I think it will really give even more detail than what we have time to go over today. And we are really at risk out in 2024 timeframe of potentially going to Tier 3 at Lake Mead or even below Tier 3. When we get below Tier 3 at Lake Mead, the Secretary of the Interior is charged with consulting with the basin states about what size reductions in water use below Lake Mead need to occur to protect Lake Mead. So there's a lot of uncertainty, and as Mark talked about the temperature trends, the water trends are also trending in a very negative direction. We will do everything we can to try to control what we can outside of what Mother Nature does or doesn't give us moving forward for water. And I believe one interesting thing that links into Mark's presentation and the temperature trends is last water year, that snow water equivalent graph that Rachel showed, it was about 89% of average precipitation, and we got 32% runoff. We have slightly less precipitation this year, and right now the projections are in the 60s, 60 percentile, or 62 to 64, 65. I haven't seen the latest. So we're getting a little bit more water out of the system due to some of that increased monsoonal activity and wetting of some of the soil, but we're still getting way below the runoff we've seen from the precipitation as compared to 20 or 30 years ago, and that is a very disturbing trend for the water managers and a huge challenge for all of us moving forward, and Mark talked about that in his presentation as well. So I will stop. If there are any questions about anything Rachel said or anything that I said, be happy to help answer them from members of the group.
Director Buchatsky, there is someone interested in asking a question. I would encourage everyone with questions to write them in the chat and I will read them for you. Some asked about the link to the briefing this Friday, and I will be adding that to the chat. Oh, thank you, Shauna. Will the link for Friday's meeting be published? It is now on the website. The link will be published or available right as the briefing will start, as it is a live broadcasted link. And there is Jerome who has a question. Jerome, feel free to write it on the chat and I will be happy to read it for you. Thank you.
Do we have a question, Nemesis?
No question as of now.
All right, thank you. We'll move on then. And I will introduce the next
Excuse me, sorry.
speaker. Sorry, go ahead.
I just got a yes from Jerome. I still don't see your question. Feel free to add it to the chat. Okay, so the question is, can Arizona thrive without the Colorado River water?
So Arizona has various water resources available to it. I don't think an issue of having zero Colorado River water is something that we're going to see. There will be some water moving forward, but there are efforts underway through something that is winding its way through the legislature called the Arizona Water Authority, a $1 billion investment that Governor Ducey spoke to in his State of the State speech in January, that both would help deploy other existing resources around our state and deploy them in places where we need them, but also to look long-term at potential augmentation projects to bring new water into our state. That potential legislation hopefully is going to make it through the process this session, but I think that would be a huge step forward for the resiliency of Arizona out into the future. So with that, I want to introduce the next speaker. It's Stephen Flora, Senior Hydrologist from the Salt River Project, and he'll give us a Salt and Verde River Watershed water supply update. Take it away, Stephen.
All right, well, thank you. Good to be here to provide an update on Srp Reservoirs and the watershed for the Salt and Verde in Arizona. If you go to the next slide, you can see where we were last year. Last year, May of 2021, our Srp Reservoir system was about 74% full. Obviously, we saw the graph. We were in fairly significant drought, extreme drought throughout much of the state this time last year. Srp reservoir systems actually filled due to 2 wet years in 19 and 20, 2 wet winters that actually nearly filled Srp reservoirs in May of 2020. But then we saw a year of extreme dry conditions leading to that last year. But our reservoir system was about 74% about a year ago today. If we go to the next slide, we can see what happened since then. Since last year, we had the second wettest monsoon in the Salt and Verde watershed in 2021. We had about 250,000 acre feet of runoff in the Salt and Verde last monsoon season through July, September, which is about 2.5 times what we saw in the winter. We only saw about 104,000 acre feet in the winter of 2021. So while our monsoons don't typically add a lot of storage and we typically get a lot of storage from those wet winters. Last monsoon was actually fairly significant in that, not necessarily adding a lot of storage, but it kept the summer, when we have peak summer demand, from losing storage during that time period when we typically lose storage in the Srp system. Instead of losing about 10 to 15%, we typically in that monsoon season, we actually gained about 3%. So that really helped keep our reservoir levels up. And then we saw a very wet, as I mentioned, a wet December, and we actually started to see some productive runoff due to the soil moisture that was added in the summer. And then there in December, we actually saw some productive runoff right at the start of the winter runoff season. So you can see we saw some flows in the Salt and Tonto up to 5,000 to 10,000 CFS. So on the next slide, you can see that we started out with fairly good watershed conditions on the Salt and Verde. Our reservoirs were still at 69% going to January 1. We saw about 150% or more of snowpack as of January 1 on the Verde and on the Salt, above normal soil moisture conditions and runoff efficiencies going in. But as we all know, La Nina was forecast for this winter and have stayed throughout the winter. So what we saw on the next slide was a very dry stretch. You can see the increased precipitation. The green solid line is water year 2022. The red is the normal precipitation, and the dotted green line is last year's. So we saw that significant December, early January precipitation, but then it essentially flatlined from there throughout most of the rest of the winter. January and February were extremely dry throughout the watershed. We saw a couple small late February to March storms that added some certain areas of the watershed, but not enough. We ended, as of April 1, we were about just a little over 7 inches of precipitation, or 76% of normal for the water year. And going into the water year, that 7-inch mark is kind of where we start really seeing more productive runoff. So we could have gotten a couple more storms. We might have seen additional runoff, but we didn't see that this winter. Next slide. So looking at what our snowpack occurred, March 1 is kind of the peak snowpack. We saw that the Verde was about 100%, and the salt was below median, about 59%. If you look on the graphs on the right, the top one is the salt, and you can see those late December storms brought it up to about median there at the beginning of January, but you can see it didn't add any snowpack throughout most of the winter to the salt. So we were well below median there in the peak snowpack on the salt. As far as the Verde, we saw that boost in late December to get us above normal, kind of brought down to normal or slightly below median. We did see a little bit of snowpack more focused on the Verde and the Mogollon Rim areas in those late February and March smaller storms that we saw, but still below normal to slightly below normal for the salt and Verde, kind of the peak snowpack in March 1. Next slide. One area that did fairly well throughout the watershed, and it's the area on the latest short-term drought status. The only area that has that yellow abnormally dry left was the Mogollon Rim area near C.C. Cragen. Those late February and late March storms actually put quite a bit of snowpack on that part of the watershed. We saw over 2 feet, 2 to 2.5 feet of snowpack in the Cragen watershed there on the rim from those storms. We had close to that, 1.5 to 2 feet from the December storms, and we didn't see a lot of runoff from that January snowpack. A lot of that sublimated or infiltrated in, but then we got a second snowpack in that area, significant second snowpack, where we did see more productive runoff. So we saw about 6,000 acre feet, which increased C.C. Cragen from about 30 to 70% full C.C. Cragen Reservoir. Next slide. Overall, for our winter runoff on the Salt, Tonto, and Verde, we did see above median runoff in January, but that was primarily from those late December storms. We saw about half of all January's runoff in the first 5 days. And then we saw that dry stretch. So February was well below normal, 36%. March was 31%, well below normal. April, we saw about the same as March, about 47,000, which is about 73% of median for April. So we saw that very strong dry stretch throughout much of January and February, which kept inflows low. We saw a very small boost from March snowmelt on the Salt and Verde. You can kind of see there as it got up to 800, 900 CFS there in late March, and then dropped off throughout April. Next slide. So as far as the January through May runoff season, on the Salt, Tonto, and Verde streamflow forecast, this is the latest April 1 forecast, had about 205,000 acre feet of runoff into the Srp reservoirs, which is about 45% of median, so well below median there. It might be slightly higher, but not by much, 215,000 maybe, because we did see a little more runoff than we expected on the Salt from those upper elevation snowpack. But you can see that, again, this is still below what we saw. This winter is below what we saw last monsoon season. So again, that kind of puts it into perspective how good the last monsoon season was and helpful that was, but also how we are here this winter with below median inflows. Next slide. So as far as Srp reservoirs, you can see that throughout the winter, we essentially didn't gain a lot of storage. due to the lower inflows, the Verde level slightly dropped as use was on the Verde. And then we swapped over to the salt system for deliveries as of late March. By April 1, we were delivering off the salt. And you can start to see that trend, that Roosevelt starting to decline as we swapped over to the salt in April. The graph on the right is the projections for the salt system. That's the total salt storage, but it gives you an idea of what to expect in the trend of Roosevelt. The green line is the using lower quartile, which is what we usually plan on. We plan for drought in our plan for our storage usage in the prop for our operations between surface water and groundwater use. And you can see a potential drop up to 20% from Roosevelt, from 73 to 53% by the end of the year. And due to how low the Verde storage is right now, continue to expect to use the salt unless we see another very wet monsoon, which helps to, which would be something similar to that red line, which is average inflows. But we don't expect that, as Mark mentioned, the same from last summer to this summer. While it's slightly chance, we don't expect to see that same runoff and boost that we got from the monsoon season last year. Next slide. So as of now, this is last week, we're about 71%. So similar to this time last year, the summer monsoon helped bring us up above our plan, our prop plan, but what this monsoon gave us, La Nina took away and put us back down close to our planned prop plan on lower quartile inflows. Our groundwater use for 2022 remained as it was in the plan for 200,000 acre feet use this year. It's likely to stay at that level or potentially slightly increase next year. As I mentioned, we swapped over to the salt system and started delivering off salt in April 1. So that's where we're at. We're about where we were last year, but unless we get a significant monsoon, we don't expect to come out at the same level as we did. And looking into next winter, it would depend on what we see next winter. Next slide. So just a couple things to reiterate, to finish up. A couple things we pointed out a year ago was some of the research that SRP has been doing on drought and climate research. The graph on the left shows historical mega droughts and how they compare to the current one in the tree ring record versus the current one, which is the solid black line. And you can see that the solid black line mega drought that we're in, we typically have 20 to 35 year droughts in the record, but this is one of the most severe that we've seen. But you can notice it drops and then kind of partially through, it levels off this decline in net deficit of basin supply. Those were the years of 2005, 2010. We have those wet years that help to refill the system and refill SRP reservoirs to get through the next stretch of drought that you can see continuing. And we kind of saw that again here in 2017, 19, and 20 that refilled the system. But we're continuing that downward trend in that mega drought. Another item that some of the research is showing is some of the differences between the Salt and Verde and the Colorado with increased temperatures, how that's going to impact to losses and evaporative losses and losses to stream flow production. The one difference between the Salt and Verde, or the difference between the Salt and Verde and the Colorado, is we typically get that winter inflow already in the January and April timeframe, and it's a mix of precipitation and snow, not just totally snow dependent like the Colorado. So even though we expect that same climate impact and an overall decline, that decline, it may not be as severe as you might see in the upper Colorado, because when we have that runoff and that snowpack is earlier, when the sun's not intense, the temperatures are, and Arizona's already dry and dries out typically in the spring, and we start over with the soil moisture into the spring. And then some of the other research is showing we may have additional, wetter periods that help refill it between those droughts. But next slide. On the next slide, one thing that also to point out is that throughout these drought periods, what's been really important to SRP supply as well is the groundwater supply SRP has in service at groundwater service area. This graph shows that second drought in that period, in that mega drought, 2011 through 2018. The green line is the actual reservoir storage, you can see. The blue line is if we didn't do any groundwater pumping and relied solely on the surface water reservoirs. And you can see that has a significant impact when we get further into those droughts, when SRP increases, groundwater pumping increases, to help maintain that surface water to get through those drought periods until you get to that next wet year that can refill. And unlike the Colorado, the Salt and Verde can refill in 1 year, which helps us get through those drought stretches. So a couple things just to end on that impact for the system. With that, knowing that we're continuing drought and climate impacts going forward, SRP is working on several projects to help not just in the SRP water supply, but at water supply reliability in Arizona, such as the SRP CAP interchange. Right now, water can come into the SRP system, but working on potentially options to move water the other way into the CAP from SRP system. Working on projects such as the Roosevelt FCS project to get a temporary plan deviation to potentially store water temporarily longer in the flood control space at Roosevelt, to put that to use if we do have a wet year that fills Roosevelt. And then another project on the Verde system to look at the Verde River sediment mitigation study that has been done with the Bureau of Reclamation, looking at how to mitigate the loss of sediment coming into Horseshoe. And that has gone through an appraisal study, went through appraisal. It's moved to a feasibility study, looking to a potential option of monitoring Bartlett Dam to add storage to make up for that sedimentation loss, plus additional storage that could be potentially like NCS water at Roosevelt when it was modified, the city could use elsewhere throughout the valley. Next slide. So overall, again, we're a pretty similar situation to where we are last year, but we don't with the summer monsoon this year, we expect to see declines throughout the summer. Our winter inflow was below median, so we didn't get a lot of storage this past winter, and we'll see how it goes into next winter. But we expect to be going into next winter likely lower than we saw this past winter. But that's about where we're at. If there's any questions.
Questions by members for Stephen?
There are no questions as of now.
Thanks, Stephen. We'll move on to the next couple agenda items, and they're going to address something we haven't really talked much about in this group historically, and that is impacts on hydropower. I think we've been kind of remiss maybe in not having representatives of that industry be part of our group. So the first speaker is Ed Garak from the Irrigation Electrical Districts Association of Arizona, and he's going to talk about impacts of drought on hydropower, and I'm happy to report that Ed has agreed to be a permanent member of our group so that we can hear these reports moving forward. So welcome, Ed.
Thanks, Tom. Next slide, please. Yeah, the title of my presentation is Drought Curtails Power. That's probably not a surprise to you, but most people don't understand the true nexus between water and power. Next slide, please. Since we're new to the group, I thought it'd be relevant to introduce the organization I work for. I'm the executive director for AIDA. We're a collection of 24 irrigation electrical districts, co-ops, municipalities, and one tribal entity. And we've been advocating on behalf of agriculture, water and power issues since 1962. And we have a particular emphasis on federal hydropower. Next slide, please. Overall, Arizona is resource long. That means we produce more energy than we need by about 25%. Next slide, please. And the system is set up for the peak demand, which typically occurs in June or July, depending on the weather, with a peak capacity of 27,000 megawatts. The primary energy source is natural gas. And hydropower, although small, it accounts for 3% of the peak in Arizona. It is very significant. It contributes significantly to the Western grid, especially with regulation of the system and with the increasing influx of renewable energy. Next slide, please. But with the increase of renewables, it's not keeping pace with the early retirements of coal plants and some other fuel sources. So we're seeing, we're creating a strain in availability. What you see in front of you is the typical pricing pattern throughout the year. Energy pricing is very dynamic. It's more than just day to day. It can actually get into an hour by hour pricing model. And typically that pricing is set at a regional hub. For Phoenix, it's the Palo Verde hub just west of town. What I wanted to show you on this slide is that prices have nearly doubled since last year, and that matters significantly when we're losing generation off the rivers and having to replace it with higher costs replacement power. Next slide, please. So hydro is impacted by two major components. The first being the hydraulic head, which is the difference between the upper and lower pools. We all know that Meade and Powell have been dropping, which is impacting the generation, but the volume that passes through the dams are also a major contributor, and we're seeing less and less, especially this year. Next slide, please. I'm going to focus on two main projects, the Colorado River Storage Project, which is a collection of dams in the upper basin. They have a total generating capacity of 1,875 megawatts. That was if everything's fully, if all the pools are full elevation, and Arizona gets approximately 10% of that power from CRISPs. Next slide, please. You can see in the upper left-hand side the production at Glen, and we're getting, it's a real threat that we're going to cross that minimum power pool line. Next slide, please. This slide's a little outdated, but even with the mitigation that has gone on recently with regards to holding back water at Powell, there's still some estimates that there's a 30% chance we could go below minimum power pool next year. Next slide, please. So these next two slides are courtesy of our friends at Colorado River Commission of Nevada. What they show here on this slide is the traditional generation from CRSP, and then of recent actual generation. And that'll parlay into the next slide, please. So what they did is they analyzed what was actual generation versus average from 1971 to 2001, and then did a market price analysis, like buying from the market as opposed to paying the federal hydropower price. And this fluctuates year to year, but I want you to focus on the bottom right-hand side. The replacement power that CRSP is had to deal with last year is roughly $63 million, and 2022 is probably closer to $120 million to replace that power that was lost compared to average. Next slide, please. So Hoover is experiencing a similar situation. It's the largest project on the Colorado River at 2,048 megawatts. Arizona receives roughly 20% of that capacity. And due to drought, we're seeing a 25% reduction in energy generation over the last 2 years. Next slide, please. Now, Parker and Davis are a little bit downstream. They're regulating pools, so their impact due to the drought has been very minimal, maybe 10% or so. Next slide, please. I'm not going to try to steal Jack Murray from Western's thunder, but I just wanted to highlight, this is a screen capture of their analysis on the impacts of the drought regarding replacement power, all the RECs that are lost, the total impacts. So when you factor in the 10% of energy that we get from CRSP, the 20% from Boulder Canyon Project, and the energy that Arizona gets from Parker Davis Project, it's at least a $30 million impact. And if you scale up the 2022 losses because of CRSP, it's probably closer to $35 million that Arizona's drought impacts are going to be to the power. Next slide, please. I touched on it a little bit briefly, but the replacement power has jumped up significantly. Natural gas is up 80% in 2022 versus 2019. The 500 plus plans keeping, you know, when you factor in GCP and 500 plus, it's over 1 million acre foot storage in Meade, not going through Hoover. And then we have the regional supply chain issues that are delaying or driving up costs of new additional capacity. Our group is participating in a purchase power agreement that's looking to add some new generation. What was originally contemplated at coming online at 2024 has been pushed back to 2025, and if not further, into 2026. Next slide, please. I can't give a presentation without speaking to the impacts of the agriculture. Our farmers are really suffering because as less surface waters on the river, they're having to move to groundwater, which is increasing the pumping demand. Fertilizer costs are up 150 to 235% this year. 40%, or potash is a big driver of that, and that's coming in out of Russia and Belarus. And we don't really know the impacts from the Russian invasion as of yet. So that completes my presentation. Happy to answer any questions.
Thanks, Ed. This is Tom. So I'll say a couple things first. I really appreciate your viewpoint in broadening a discussion of the impacts, including the last slide with the impacts on agriculture and other items impacting that industry in our state. I will say, Ed, that I did see last week in Mexico City a presentation by Upper Colorado River Commission. You had mentioned that the 30% probability of Lake Powell going below 3490 was a bit outdated. I think the presentation I saw is with the roughly 1 million acre feet we were going to leave behind in Lake Powell based on the actions taken by the United States earlier this week. That probability, according to that presentation, is reduced down to a 3% probability. So showing that that action is pretty effective in protecting minimum power pool. Again, just want to make sure that that information, updated information, is out there and for everyone to understand what that plan, what those actions are potentially going to create. And of course, we do know on the flip side that that water now is not going through 480,000 acre feet, is not going through Glen Canyon Dam, and you're going to lose that power generation. So it's a mixed bag, as always, in terms of what we're trying to accomplish and how we try to balance all of the impacts. And with that, I'll ask if members of the group have any questions for Ed.
Director Buchatsky, there are a couple questions. The first one is, does California Access Energy help Arizona? From Mr. Frank Koppel.
It does during the solar glut. I believe APS and SRP have benefited from that for quite a few years. But technically, California is about 20% short on production, so they don't have excess energy. In fact, FERC gave them a license to take energy if they need it because of the blackouts and the fact that they're resource short. So that is something that Arizona, the power community, has been keeping an eye on and fully aware of.
And then I'll just add, in terms of the blackout issue described, I know that both Hoover and Glen Canyon are critical to kind of the restarts when those impacts hit the grid. And it's another kind of impact that we don't hear much about, but that I'm aware of as well. So a second question, Nemesis?
So since we are a little bit tight in time, we can leave the rest of the questions to the call to the public, point number 12 on the agenda, and we can continue into the other presentation.
All right, thank you. And thanks, Ed, and look forward to having you participate with us moving forward on a regular basis.
Thanks,
Now we'll
Tom.
turn to, yes, Jack Murray from the Federal Western Area Power Administration. Appreciate, Jack, you taking the time to also meet with us here in Arizona and describe the impacts from WAPA's perspective.
All right, thank you, Tom. I appreciate everyone being able to visit with this group this morning. So as he said, my name is Jack Murray. I'm with the Western Area Power Administration here in Phoenix. I'm officially the Vice President of Transmission System Asset Management, currently on special assignment to the administrator to work on things like WAPA's drought response and that sort of thing. So I just wanted to take a minute, since I've never been to this group, and I'm not sure if others have been from WAPA, to kind of talk about who we are, who WAPA is. Western Area Power Administration, obviously, we're a federal agency and actually one of 4 power marketing administrations within the Department of Energy. The other 3 are Bonneville Power, most of you have probably heard of, up in Oregon, Southeastern Power Administration headquartered in Georgia, and Southwestern Power Administration headquartered in Oklahoma. WAPA's headquarters is just outside of Denver, and the Desert Southwest Regional Office that I support is right here in Phoenix. We're a wholesale supplier of electricity, marketing and delivering federal hydropower to our customers in the communities they serve. Next slide, please. Got a little behind on that. As you can see on the map, WAPA's customers span about 15 states throughout the central and western U.S., and our customers are many of the same customers Ed just talked about: co-ops, municipalities, tribal nations. We have several military installations and other nonprofit entities. Across WAPA, we've got about 17,000 miles of high voltage transmission lines, and we market and sell that energy, that electricity, to more than 40 million, to about those 700 customers who provide power to about 40 million customers across the West. Within WAPA's Desert Southwest region, the hydropower that we market is generated from 4 dams on the Colorado River operated by the Bureau. That's Hoover, Davis, Parker, and several of our Arizona customers have Glen Canyon power as well. If you want to go to the next slide. So some of this information is similar to what Ed was talking about, but what I want to do is kind of use our Parker Davis project as an example of how the drought and high power prices impact the project financially, which directly impacts our customers. So this graph shows the amount of generation for Parker Davis for fiscal year 2022, which for the federal government started in October of 21. So we're a little over halfway through. It shows actual data for the first 6 months of the year, and then it shows forecasts for the remaining 6 months. The forecasted data comes from Reclamation's 24-month study, which we've heard some other folks kind of talk about and explain here. In the blue part of the graph, we show the power for each month in the year, which totals about 1,325 gigawatt hours of generation. Now, just to give it some perspective, a gigawatt hour is about enough energy to power about 750,000 quote unquote average homes for a year. In blue, we show the power for each month in the year. We already said that. The generation then is shaped based on water releases. You'll see that in the spring and summer, the releases are higher as compared to the rest of the year. The orange part of the graph shows the amount of purchases needed for each month, or for the year 2022, about 108 gigawatt hours. So we're forecasting for 2022 to purchase rather than generate through Parker and Davis dams about 8% of the power that we'll sell our customers. Now we're purchasing because we're not running enough water through the turbines to generate that additional power that we need. So seemingly that's not too bad, but if you go to the next slide, we'll take a little bit deeper look at what that means for customers. So let's take a look at the price of those purchases. Ed talked about it a little bit, but shown in orange, you can see the average purchase price by month for fiscal year 2022. Again, the graph shows 6 months of actual purchases and 6 months of forecast prices. As you can see, the prices run from anywhere from a low of $47 a megawatt hour to a high of $159 a megawatt hour. Now, as with any commodity, the average price can be kind of misleading, but it's a kind of a typical way and a necessary way to show the data. The reason it's a little bit misleading is because what you don't see in those average monthly bars is the price spikes Ed was talking about that occur when the market is short on power, such as when California's having a heat wave or we're experiencing a polar vortex or something like that causes the price to spike. In a number of those hours, we were exposed to prices of upwards of $800 a megawatt hour. Of course, at WAPA, we try to minimize that exposure by making purchases to meet our contractual obligations in advance. But as you can imagine, that has its own risks in terms of whether or not you're going to need that power when the time comes. The blue bar on this graph shows the price of power sold by Parker Davis, the rate set by WAPA for Parker Davis power, and that's around $15 a megawatt hour. And the reason for that disparity is because by law, WAPA's rates are cost-based. We're recovering the costs of operating and maintaining the systems. So the takeaway for this slide really that I want people to be aware of is the disparity in prices between Parker Davis project power and market power. Really, it means that the purchases are expensive and they're only getting more so. Okay, if we go to the next slide. Okay, so this is just a real simple table that brings the quantity of power that I talked about in the first slide together with the price of power in the second slide to see what that means in terms of cost. And all of these costs are passed on to WAPA's customers and ultimately down the line to the customers of those people that we sell power to. So if you look at the first column, it's just the year, then the quantity of purchases in gigawatt hours, then the total purchase cost. And then what we did is we wanted to compare that with the total typical cost to operate the dams, Parker and Davis dams, which is about $18 million a year. So if you look at that for 2022, we're forecasting $13.3 million in purchases, or about 72% of our annual operating costs. Now, for the future years, you see that the cost is less and it looks a little bit better, but that's only because the out-year prices are forecast to return to normal levels. But even at normal levels, you can see the cost efficiency of our hydropower being diluted because the market prices would still account for 50 to 60% of our operating costs. And if those prices remain elevated, which we believe they probably will based on everything we've heard today, we'll be facing those same high purchase power costs in 23 and forward that we are for 2022. And one thing I want to point out is that when WAPA makes those purchases, on behalf of customers to firm up our contractual obligations, the operating costs of the dam don't go down. It costs the same same level of maintenance and operations costs at the dams is still there. So let's go to the next slide. And this is a slide that Ed showed, but what we did was we wanted to take a look at both Hoover and Parker Davis to show what the cost of the drought itself is in terms of replacement power, ancillary services that maybe aren't available because there's not as much generation activity going on, ancillary services, resource adequacy, RECs, all that sort of thing. These amounts don't include any costs specific to our customers. Impacts to agriculture, like Ed talked about. You know, you have the agricultural industry is getting hit really twice, if you think about it, because at a time when hydropower output is decreasing and the water allocations to them are decreasing, they're needing more power to turn from surface water to pumped water. So they need more power, but they're paying for but the cost for that power is elevated. So they're kind of getting hit from all sides there. So anyway, this table, just to make sure everybody understands, doesn't have anything in it regarding impacts to agriculture, lost production, or opportunity costs. This is just the cost of reduced power. And as you can see for Hoover, for 9 years, we projected it out. That's $939 million, or about $104 million a year. Or Parker Davis, about $42 million, or $5 million a year. Now this is system wide. I didn't break this down to just Arizona customers, but it's a significant impact. And then the last slide I had is just if you go to the next slide, this is a list of the directly affected Arizona customers. And I intentionally use the term directly because the overall cost in terms of economic losses in the economy as it trickles down is difficult to measure, at least for me, since I'm not an economist. But as an example, agriculture alone in Arizona is about a $23 billion plus industry, and it's dependent on power to deliver its water. And even more dependent on power now because of the drought situation reducing their surface water allocations. It's a sizable impact. And so again, I thank you for allowing me to come and talk to you today. And if there's any questions, I'll take them.
Thanks, Jack. And we'll, for time's sake, keep this to just members of the group, the interagency group. And I will say, while folks might be thinking about questions, I much appreciate, Jack, the information. And we'll be hitting up you or others from WAPA in the future for this group. And hopefully, I know you'll do all you can to help participate with us. I think it's really important that we've added in this discussion into this group because, like I mentioned earlier, we've been a little bit remiss in that regard in doing that, at least in this group, the Interagency Task Force. So, Nemesis, are we getting any questions from members?
Just one question that we can answer at the end during the call to the public.
Thanks. We'll move on. Thanks again, Jack. So we'll move on to impact of drought on the Navajo Nation, and Carly Mcclellan, Senior Hydrologist with the Navajo Nation Department of Water Resources, will give a presentation. Welcome, Carly.
Yeah, welcome everyone. Hello, thank you for the invite and the opportunity to give updates with the Navajo Nation. Again, my name is Carly Mcclellan, Senior Hydrologist with Navajo Nation Water Management Branch. So my presentation is pretty short. I think a lot of the other presenters hit on a lot of the other areas with regard and other indices with regards to the state of Arizona, and also just want to focus on mostly the drought indice of SPI. And with other factors that one could look at, like SPEI, we've been hit with a lot of heavy winds and high temperatures here within the past several weeks and days. But nonetheless, let's move on to the first slide there, or next slide. Just a quick overview. The program I oversee and represent is the water monitoring inventory section, and we mostly our department, we're here to oversee and monitor and collect data for surface water monitoring, and so most of that is specific to precip rain cans, and which we measure monthly, and then also during the winter months we participate in the snow surveys, report a lot of all of our data to NRCS, which is contributes to the Snowpack report, and for the state of Arizona and New Mexico as well. And so just wanted to give that kind of that oversight for those who might not know anything about our program. And so nonetheless, next slide. Here on Navajo Nation, just some of the drought vulnerable groups are, you know, a lot of our people that haul water that don't have running water. Also, even our public water systems, you know, I know that within TUA, with the tribal utility, I know that they've been experiencing, and I can't really speak for them, but I know that I used to work for them years ago, and when I did work with them, I know that they've been over the years dealing with issues of declining static water level to a lot of their public water supplies as well. So I'm sure it's probably still the same, if not getting worse, you know. And but you know, also irrigators and people who do dryland farming, oftentimes they get affected. Livestock ranchers, wildlife, and of course recreation, and others. There's probably more. I just listed a few here. Next slide. Then this is just we do have a drought contingency plan that was drafted in 2003. I'm not going to read all those little bullets there, but nonetheless, just wanted to let everyone know that we do have a drought contingency plan. I know that there's been planning in the works to update this drought contingency plan. I know that we were kind of moving that direction pre-COVID, and then COVID hit, and then all that just kind of got put on the back burner. So I'm not sure exactly when we're going to revisit all that again, but nonetheless, we do have a set of guidelines that are available to the nation, Navajo Nation, to look at and also refer to in terms of drought mitigation and planning as well. So next slide. So in that drought contingency plan, the primary indice that Navajo Nation looks at is SPI. And one of the things I mentioned was in the revision of the drought contingency plan going forward, definitely one thing I do want to consider adding as an additional drought indice to be included in the revised, updated drought contingency plan, whenever that happens, is to include other indices such as evaporative demand, and you know, other indices such as SPEI. But as for now, the current drought contingency plan solely looks at SPI, and so this is kind of just a flow chart of what we follow, and so it's very similar to the SPI values where you have the drought stage of normal, alert, warning, and emergency. They're very similar, close to the U.S. Drought Monitor And so you could essentially, if you make those correlations with the U.S. Drought Monitor, then you'll be able to see the same ranking. Emergency would be like the equivalent of D4 and whatnot. So, all right, next slide. Again, you know, I think this is just highlighting that the most severe stage, which is when the SPI is lower than negative 1.5, then that's when these recommendations are enacted and whatnot. And so, yeah, so next slide. All right, so just kind of focusing on, you know, meteorological events and the actual precipitation that that we monitor. We have a total of 85 rain cans that we measure and monitor every month. And of course, since coming out of COVID and during COVID, it's like we have a lot of holes and gaps in our data, and so there's you know, there wasn't always time or availability to collect a lot of these sites, and also we had some of our cans that underwent damage due to weather and them freezing and whatnot, and so so there's a lot of holes there, but nonetheless, I just kind of wanted to make it known to the group that we do have a network of 85 rain cans that we are measuring monthly. And so this is just to give you an idea of where all these cans are located at. They're separated by routes. And so next slide. And this shows you all the rain cans on Navajo Nation. You can see that most of the rain can density is scattered mostly through the highest densities are most scattered mostly through the Chuska Mountain ranges, where we get more seasonal summer variability, whereas, you know, like some of these other areas, the Western Agency, north of Flagstaff, those regions, they're a little bit more sparsely distributed or dispersed. And so, but, you know, I think a lot of that, a lot of these were placed and planned and put where they were through a lot of work over the years with a number of different universities and consultants and whatnot. But nonetheless, Navajo Nation, geographically, land size, mass, we're about the size of West Virginia, so a pretty good size land mass for us to monitor. But but again, nonetheless, it's like something that we are working on trying to get back to normal, so to speak, you know, because we've had a lot of different challenges that we've had to overcome and are still trying to overcome with a lot of budgetary type issues that we've been dealing with, you know, since the whole issue of COVID came about and still coming out of it. And so, but next slide. So, like I said, you know, this is just the latest U.S. Drought Monitor. Since I'm focusing primarily on the SPI indice, you could see that the northern Navajo County has got more of the severe D3 drought status for Navajo Nation, and but Apache County, we're sitting a little bit more closer to D2. Little areas of Coconino County, way up in the northern portion of it, hitting little shades of D3 there. But it's and so next slide. I just kind of wanted to show that. So I just wanted to show some trends, both 3, 6, 9, and 12-month SPI values, and of the tribal agencies within Arizona. There is one other agency, Eastern Agency, which I didn't include in this presentation, and that's all in the state of New Mexico. So I intentionally didn't include them because, you know, this is of course an Arizona meeting, but I could have included the eastern side, but I just kept it solely focused on Arizona. So this is just some of the trends that that I was able to compile using our tool that we've been using, the drought severity evaluation tool that was put together by both NASA and Desert Research Institute and Climate Engine over the past several years. But next slide. Again, this is just kind of a one-year trend, and so you can see this one here is for the Chinle Agency, and of course the agencies are like synonymous to U.S. U.S. States, or akin to U.S. states, and then of course the chapter boundaries are like more akin to like U.S. counties and whatnot. So what we have here is the Chinle Agency, which is kind of like central portion of Navajo Nation, and you can see that the 3-month SPI, which is on the top left there, you could see that we're, you know, looking at current conditions, we're sitting like close to like near normal conditions or the 0 SPI. But, you know, you look at the trends, you could see that, you know, you see a slight gradual improvement compared to the whole year. And then as you move to the 6-month SPI, the 180-day, you know, you could see, and then as you could see some of the changes in the patterns, but mostly you can see most of the patterns still holding. And then as you move to the 9-month SPI, and then looking clear into the 1-year SPI, you could see that when you look at more of the long term, the 1 year, you could see where we stood last year compared to this year, and made significant improvements in our drought status. However, we're still, even with those improvements, we're still at a roughly negative 0.25 SPI, and still deficient. I know that. Go ahead, next slide. I know that Snowpack's been pretty low for us as well too, in comparison to previous years. But this year's for the Fort Defiance Agency, and the Fort Defiance Agency is mostly it's closest to the Arizona-New Mexico border, and so you can see the trends. Not much improvement in the 3-month SPI, but as you go into the, and again, 3 and 6 month are not very different, or pretty similar, but as you progress into like the 9 and 12-month SPI, you could see the huge difference between the 3 and the 1 year SPI differences. You know, although the short term hasn't made much improvement, but you can see the long term, we've made some drastic improvements. Again, we're still in the negatives for the SPIs there for the Fort Defiance Agency. Next slide. And again, this is for Shiprock Agency, which is, you know, there's Shiprock Agency covers New Mexico and Arizona, and but you know there are a number of areas. A good portion of Shiprock Agency also encompasses the northeast portion of Arizona as well. So quite interesting as well too is you look at the 3-month SBI, and there's really not a whole lot of improvements there. There's not a whole lot of change, but as you kind of look as the time series progresses in, from the 3 to the 6 into the 9 to the 1 year, you can see that that we were in pretty bad shape last year. Although we're doing better, we're still not where we should be. Again, you know, it looks like a lot of the improvements I think that are contribute to the overall status as well too. Is looking at some of these the monsoon events that we had last year, but you know those are pretty minimal contributions as well, and mostly considered that we were in a La Nina winter again for last year and this year again, and then you know the snowpack's been pretty low. So that's definitely affecting our stream flows as well too. So next slide. This here is Western Navajo. This is the Western Navajo kind of borders like Page and throughout Cameron and north of Flagstaff. That whole region. Most of Coconino County is encompassed by the Western Agency, and so again, it's pretty interesting. You look at the short-term 3-month SBI, and there's really not a whole lot of change there. But again, as you look at the trends going clear into the 1 year, you can see that you know there's significant improvements, but yet you know we're still not where we should be. So this is all I have in terms of the SPI value trends by agencies in Arizona. Next slide. And so kind of also just wanted to make note that some of the impacts I've been seeing personally throughout Western Navajo and different areas of Navajo Nation is that we've I think like in early, I know that in early March and mid through early April, we actually had a lot of the stock ponds and dams that were for livestock that we normally see as we go on our routes. We've been seeing a lot of these stock ponds with water. I think they received several winter fronts and events where they were able to collect water and hold water for livestock, and in comparison to like last year, you know, those were all dry. But I recently went through Western Agency again, and a lot of the stock ponds are completely dry, which I think a lot of that is attributed to the evaporative index and a lot of the heavy winds that it's any surface water water ponding that we may have had for livestock. I think most of that is all just evaporated away, and so we're looking at pretty dry conditions again as well too. So I think that you know overall, I know that this meeting again is usually considering the conditions and everyone else's presentations. I think a lot of this is going to be a no-brainer in terms of our recommendations to the governor. So I think that I think that although my presentation focused primarily on the SPI values and not a whole lot of the other drought indices, but nonetheless, I think that it kind of complements what everyone else has been saying, or at least supports it. And so with that, I conclude my presentation, and if there's any questions, I'll be open to answering anything that you guys may have. Thank you.
Thanks, Carly. Questions of members for Carly?
No questions at the moment.
Thank you. So we'll go to the last presentation. Jason Howder from Aiken Gumstrauss Power and Feld, representing the Gila River community, is going to talk about impacts to the community. Jason?
Hi, thanks, Tom. My presentation today is essentially an update to a presentation I made last year. And yeah, I think it's 10 minutes or so, so I'll try to, I know we're nearing the end here, so I'll try to go through this fairly quickly. It summarizes how the drought impacts the community and what the community has been doing to try to mitigate the drought impacts on the community and on the state. So we can go to the next slide. So when the community settled its claims to the Gila River and the watersheds to the Gila River, it agreed in part to resolve those claims to take CAP water as an in lieu supply to resolve its claims. This was not an easy decision for the community because CAP water has kind of two disadvantages. One, it's an expensive water supply compared to Gila River supplies, and it's a lower priority water compared to the Gila River water, which the community had an time immemorial right to. So, but it was part of the bargaining of that settlement. It agreed to ultimately take CAP water as part of its settlement, and it made it the community the single largest entitlement holder of CAP water. The community has both non-Indian ag priority water in the CAP system and CAP M&I priority water. The community is currently in the most recent tiers under DCP, the community's NIA priority is most at risk. Under a tier 1 shortage, the unmitigated impact is over 71,000 acre feet reduction to its NIA supply. Under a tier 2 or worse, the community loses all of its NIA supply, which is in excess of 120,000 acre feet, if there's no mitigation. And then its Indian priority or M&I priority water is also reduced by a smaller amount, but it is impacted under tier 2B and tier 3 scenarios. Of its M&I supply, the community has a little over 70,000 acre feet that is not under contract, under lease or exchange. So, most of these contracts are for 100 years. About 15,000 acre feet returns to the community in 2045. There's one agreement that it's a 25-year exchange agreement with CAGRID. So, in 2045, that water comes back. But much of its M&I supply is tied up and under agreements. Go to the next slide, please. Currently, the community only relies on about 20 to 40,000 acre feet of a CAP supplies for its on-reservation demand. That'll likely increase over time as it increases recharge projects on the reservation, but it's unlikely to get over 60,000 acre feet in any given year. So this is essentially left about 150 to 170,000 acre feet of annual flex supply that is primarily comprised of NIA priority water. Lately, the community has used much of this water for Lake Mead conservation as efforts of the DCP implementation and most recently as part of the 500+ plan. Prior to the DCP, much of this water was delivered to GSFs to create long-term storage credits. And a lot of municipalities currently do that in the state. So the community was following the similar patterns or water uses of municipalities. The shift in the use of this water for Lake Mead conservation has reduced supplies for GSFs, particularly in Pinal County, and a number of presenters here talked about the efforts to conserve water in Lake Mead having knock-on impacts like reduction in power generation in Lake Mead, and also some irrigators having to rely more on pumped water than on surface water. The community has decided to make this shift largely because it wants to protect this flex supply, which is its only significant volume of water, which is only a large amount of water if it remains in a tier 1 or better. So in the past, the community has been very steadfast in its support to keep the lake levels as high as possible and really trying to avoid falling below Tier 1. This year, there's a very real chance that we will be in a Tier 2 shortage, very likely it's a Tier 2A. But the community, I think others think there's still a realistic chance that we can maintain a Tier 1 shortage if we can increase conservation efforts in 2022 and really meet the goals of the 500 plus. Next slide, please. So this graph illustrates the community's contribution since 2016, contributions of water to Lake Mead. The total is about 540,000 acre feet. This is through contributions through 2021, and then the contracted contributions in 2022. Tom mentioned in the hydro, or I think maybe it was Rachel mentioned in the hydrological report on the Colorado River, the April study includes the water that the community is contracted for in terms of its ICS creation and system conservation. So since we entered into a contract at the end of last year. The light blue is system conservation water. The orange is ICS. So much of the community's of conservation activities has been storing water in Lake Mead. The gray is for the first time happening this year, and that's the DCP reduction, reductions to its community's available wet water. Look at my notes here. Go to the next slide. So in 2022, the community will contribute nearly 171,000 acre feet toward Lake Mead. 41,000 acre feet is part of the DCP, where the community is foregoing a substantial amount of wet water mitigation. The community has also committed nearly 130,000 acre feet of additional conservation in the form of ICS and system conservation that are part of the 500 plus plan. So that was on top of the DCP contribution. The community is largely able to do that because it reduced some on-reservation irrigation. That was something the community decided to do to find ways to reduce less water for irrigation purposes through a combination of fallowing some lands and then altering some irrigation practices and being with better conservation. The hope of the community is that the collective efforts under the 500 plus plan and the lower base will keep us in a Tier 1 in 2023 as well. So like I said before, we have a shot. We are working with others to see what additional conservation can take place this year. And we'll see where we're at come August. Next slide, please. Drought has caused the community to shift its water use from in-state storage to Lake Mead storage and conservation. This year, like I said before, is the first time the community is directly impacted in terms of on-reservation use when the community farms agreed to reduce its CAP water usage. And the community continues to take actions to reduce its reliance on CAP water so it can be as drought resilient as possible. The community will always have some demand for CAP water, particularly for its recharge projects in the future. But it wants to be prepared for those years where there'll be curtailment of CAP water and it can continue to meet its demands on reservation. So try to be quick since we're running out of time, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thanks, Jason. Much appreciate the community's efforts. Very interesting to hear the real details that you went through. So members, any questions for Jason before we get to the declaration recommendation discussion?
No questions right now.
So hearing none, I know that Alan Clark did join us, and I know he has to leave shortly, so I'll first turn to Alan if you want to give your viewpoint on whether or not we make a recommendation to the governor on maintaining the current drought emergency declaration and what factors are playing into your decision. So Alan, if you're there, go ahead.
Yeah, Director, thank you very much. And I do need to drop here in just a couple minutes to attend the noon meeting. First and foremost, I want to thank all the presenters and just thank you for putting this together. Always very informative. Based on the fact that I've heard no increases of really moisture, sustained moisture, and we're projecting some moisture, but who knows if that comes to play. And with all the presentations that we're given, and the fact that we've seen little to no improvement across the state, I would recommend that we keep the declaration in place.
Thanks, Alan. So I agree with that. And again, for similar reasons, we're seeing trends that are negative, seeing projections of continued dry and hotter temperatures impacting our surface water runoff, seeing impacts expanding into power to our farmers, to our tribes, et cetera. And I think Carly said it well, it's kind of a no-brainer in my mind. So I would give the opportunity for any of the members to weigh in on any specifics that they would like to add, or if any of the members believe that there's an outcome that's different than making a recommendation to the governor to continue the drought emergency declaration. I'd like to hear that as well. So members, go ahead and you can tee up your desire to speak through the chat box.
Chris Carlson added a comment that he concurs with the decision.
Thank you, Chris.
Mark agreed to continue declaration fully. Aaron Saffel agreed. Susan Chase agreed.
Thank you.
Stephen Flora agreed. No new comments.
Thanks, Rule. All right, thanks. Sounds like we have no dissenting opinions. So as usual, we will have the staff work up the report and the recommendation letter to the governor's office. I do want to give an opportunity real quickly here. And again, I want to echo Alan's comments to all of the presenters and all the work that everyone's been doing on the committees, et cetera. We much appreciate that, and it's very important. I know Nemesis set aside a couple of questions as we were going through presentations. I'd be happy to stay on to the extent I can help answer a couple of those questions, Nemesis, if you want to go through those quickly. If we can't, perhaps those who asked the questions, we might be able to get a response to them offline. Pressing questions, Nemesis?
Yeah, thank you, Director. We have two related to energy. So one is from Frank Koppel. Who are sources of purchased energy? And I believe this was asked to Mr. Jack Murray.
Yeah, if we have just a second, the real short answer is the suppliers are pretty much wherever we can get it when we need it. Now that's a very oversimplified answer, because if we're selling energy into California, we have to be concerned about greenhouse gas emissions and that kind of thing. But generally, other utilities, independent power producers that might be long when we're short. Historically, as an example, one of our largest trading partners for WAPA in the Southwest had been the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power, just as an example.
Thank you, Mr. Murray. And we have one last question, and this one is directed to Ed Jurek. It's a question regarding natural gas as related to fracking in northern Arizona. It says fracking consumes volumes of water and leaves toxins. How can fracking be considered for power generation?
Well, fracking is used to generate or extract natural gas and oil out of the ground. Typically, natural gas is a byproduct of oil exploration. Some people have concerns about fracking given the water and environmental issues that it possesses. There's advancements in technology and trying to eliminate those toxins, but my guess is to generate natural gas. I'm unaware of that occurring in northern Arizona. There is some interest in helium up there, but I'm not aware of any ongoing projects in northern Arizona.
Thank you. I don't see any additional questions.
Right. So I want to thank members of the group and the public for attending today. Our next meeting will be in the fall, in November of 2022. Hopefully you all will continue to follow along with us as we discuss this publicly in presentations like we're doing on Friday. And I think there'll be many more discussions of the drought issues. And I certainly have been requested over the last few weeks by media to do interviews on a daily basis or more. So it's something that's going to continue to be out in the public domain, out in the news, and I intend to be as transparent as I can about what I know and what's going on. And as Mark said, unfortunately, sometimes being a messenger of negativity, but I will commit to all of you that what I know will be shared with you, whether that's a good story, a bad story, or an indifferent story. So with that, I will adjourn the meeting. Thanks, everyone.